Hi, welcome to my presentation on redundancy in government documents. My name is Amy Barchowskis, and this study was done as an industrial practicum with Barcelona Supercomputing Center and Monica Marrero, a postdoctoral researcher there. I am completing a master's in science degree at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. The high-level objective of this study was to use open source data from e-government initiatives and see how studying redundancies and similarities in those documents can be used to provide summary information to citizens. Today, I'm going to offer an objective, a hypothesis, an overview of the project work done in the form of a literature review, the data that was used, and methodologies, mention some results, and give a conclusion. So the objective of this study was to help people understand and extract information from documents produced by open data and e-government initiatives. The hypothesis is that repetition, and more specifically redundancy and word similarities, convey information about how a government entity that produced a corpus operates, specifically something like named entity relationships. An overview of the work done. So for this project, I conducted a literature review. I extracted data from two sources, and I used two methodologies and will present some results from those methodologies. Literature review. On this slide, I've offered 3 quotes from papers in the literature that talk about similarity and redundancies in text mining and how they may be a useful source of information. I'm not going to read all of them now, but I do want to bring your attention to the third one from the study entitled Linguistic Redundancy in Twitter. You'll see that part of this quote says, "The high redundancy in microblogs gives the unprecedented opportunity to study classical tasks." It goes on to talk about how in Twitter and microblogs, there is original and emerging linguistic style, specifically things like ungrammatical structure and colloquial expressions and abbreviations. When we have language, we don't necessarily always know what to look for in domain-specific corpora. So by studying redundancy and similarity, we could start to pick up things that we wouldn't necessarily know to look for. This is also applicable in things like the corpora produced by government entities. We might not necessarily know what we're looking for at first, but studying redundancy and similarities might expose these trends. In the literature, you'll see that there are 3 methods used, 3 high-level method types used to study redundancy and similarity. These 3 groups can be summarized as corpus, knowledge, and hybrid-based measures of similarity. On this slide, I have some examples of these similarity measures amongst corpora and across words or documents. I'm not going to talk about all of them now in the interest of time, and if I have time at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about one of the most successful methods, the Google trigrams. Data. So the objective of the study at Barcelona Supercomputing Center is to study redundancy in Barcelona's municipal gazette. This data is provided online in the form of PDFs, and as you may be familiar, extracting data from PDFs can be extremely messy. And for both this reason and also more importantly, the reason that all of this data is in Catalan, I selected a secondary data source, the minutes of the Federal Open Market Commission, because it's in English, so it enables me to sanity check the methodologies and their results. It also has text versions, plain text versions available online, which makes the data cleaning process a lot more straightforward. So mostly I'll be focusing on results from the FOMC data, and specifically I constructed 3 corpora from this data from the minutes from the years 2005, 2006, and 2007. Methodologies. I used 2 different methodologies to study redundancy and similarity in the 2 data sources. The first is the Needleman-Wunsch global sequence alignment, and the second was a more experimental approach using cosine similarities to cluster pairs of documents that shared words. The first methodology is the Needleman-Wunsch global alignment. The Needleman-Wunsch global alignment uses dynamic programming to find the best global alignment of two sequences of text. Here's an example. Every pipe in this example represents that two words in the sequence of text do not match. The dash dash represents that the first sentence needed a gap insertion to be aligned with the second. In this case, in most cases, two sentences are not going to be of the same length, so you not only need to account for matches and mismatches in words, but also for the best alignment in terms of adding gaps, such as to shift the shorter sentence to align with the longer sentence, for example. So this global alignment algorithm results in a score of the best global alignment. And here I just have an example of how you might start this filling in of the matrix type algorithm, where you solve for each cell a smaller subproblem, and at the end you have a solution, you have the optimal solution to the larger problem, which is the best global alignment between two sequences of text. Here's the distribution of the Needleman-Wunsch scores for the FOMC and Gazzetta Corpora. So I ask you to keep these scores in mind as I move to the next slide, which is that we need to find a threshold for redundancy. So we have all of these scores, we have many scores across the corpora, and we need to determine what score is a threshold for that signals redundancy. So in order to determine this, I used human crowdsourcing on a platform called PyBasa, and asked 6 students of economics to classify 40 document pairs and decide if they were redundant or not redundant. Using the results of this experiment, I was able to construct 2 histograms. So the histogram that you will find on the left is a histogram of the scores that were marked redundant by humans, and on the right is a histogram of the scores marked not redundant. And from this, I defined a threshold of redundancy as a score of 0. So the second methodology I used, as I mentioned, was a little bit more experimental, and it used cosine similarity to cluster a fully connected graph of many documents, of many more documents. So cosine similarity captures the commonality in words. So the reason why I wanted to study this approach is if you look at the document pairs that are picked by the Needleman-Wunsch threshold of 0, you'll find that they are extremely similar in that they are completely redundant with the exception of a couple of words. And I want to find a way to understand similarities across texts and their topics in a more nuanced way. So here's an example of 2 documents having a cosine similarity, a positive cosine similarity, but a negative Needleman-Wunsch score. So you'll see that they share a number of words and tags, but would not be scored at all as redundant. So when you threshold all of the sentences with this cosine similarity score, I use a threshold of 0.25, which basically gives me a much larger fully connected graph where I hope to cluster documents which share similar words, but not necessarily similar word patterns or exact patterns. So we have a fully connected graph, and in order to cluster this graph into separate clusters, I chose to use the algorithm, the Karger algorithm, which approximates a min k cut of the fully connected graph. So in this slide, I have an example of what this looks like. You have a fully connected graph, and to create a min cut of a fully connected graph, you want to find a partition of vertices into two or more distinct sets, such that edges crossing from one set of vertices into the other set of vertices is minimized. So the set of edges here is minimized at 2. You can see for yourself that Any other way to partition this graph would result in crossing more than two edges. Okay, so some results. So using the Needleman-Wunsch threshold, I was able to take from the database of document pairs all the document pairs with a Needleman-Wunsch score of greater than 0. Using this, I was able to construct a complete graph, but intuitively found to be true, which is kind of what I expected, which is that this graph was not fully connected. This graph was actually composed of a smaller set of graphs, say, if you have 100 and something document pairs, you really just have 7 separated clusters where from one cluster you might not be able to travel to another cluster. So in order to represent these clusters, I here have chosen to represent them using something called a centroid, which is basically representative of the most fully connected vertex in a given cluster. And as you'll see in these results, these are really a good summary of FOMC minutes. They talk about the different objectives of the committee, the different responsibilities, and I'll just highlight the one on the middle of this slide, which says at its June meeting, the Federal Open Market Committee decided to increase the target level of the federal fund rates 25 basis points to 3%. And from what little I know of the FOMC, I know that one of its primary responsibilities is to regulate inflation by defining the federal funds rate. So in summary, for the Needleman-Wunsch thresholds, the FOMC results have offered a good summary of meetings. They assess market conditions and they discuss the implementation of monetary policy. Gazetta results are less clear. In aggregate, you see that there's some repetition about government positions. However, there's still some data cleaning that is required. A lot of the centroids that are picked up are actually just organizational components. So they're not actually sentences, but things like headers or lists of things. And these organizational components are often repeated across documents, but are not necessarily the content that we are looking for. In summary, for the cosine similarity-based clustering, I ran the algorithm on a small subset, but more experiments are needed. You need to run this algorithm many, many times in one estimation to run the algorithm, for a sufficient amount of time for a high probability of the minimum cut. You would need to run it for 95 days. So I ran it on a very small subset, and the results for FOMC, the cluster centroids that were found were interesting, and they definitely gave some more specific and different results than the Needleman-Wunsch thresholds. However, I don't necessarily think that they are definitively correct and that they might not be representative of a larger subset. So in conclusion, I found that the FOMC results using the Needleman-Wunsch threshold offer a good source of summarization, and this may be sufficient for the task. However, I do think that, if more nuanced analysis of a corpora is of interest, more experiments are needed, and I think using these word-based document similarities may add additional value. And Gazetta corpora, I think, requires a little bit more data cleaning before we get successful results from even the Needleman-Wunsch threshold. Thanks for listening, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.